Here we go. We are here for AI in book publishing. Welcome, welcome everybody who is coming in right now. Make yourselves comfortable. We have an hour to cover what we could really talk about for days. So we're going to get started right away so we can make the most of our time, but just kind of a what to expect. We're going to talk about the state of AI in publishing first. Then we're going to talk about some ways to protect yourself. And then we're going to also talk about ways that AI might actually be good for your career. And then we'll be opening it up for Q&A. We have a lot of people here today, so we very likely will not get to all questions, but please do ask your questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. And that is where we will be able to pull questions, and we will try to get through as many as we possibly can. So without further ado, I would like to have our wonderful experts here introduce themselves. Rebecca, I will start with you. Will you just say hello to everybody?
Hello, I'm Rebecca Ackermann, and I am calling from San Francisco. And my background is that I worked in tech for about a decade on lots of emerging technologies, including AI and some generative AI. And then since then, I've been writing about technology and culture for places like MIT Tech Review, Slate, Fast Company, and other outlets. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. So glad you're here. And of course, Jane probably needs no introduction, but we'll have her do it anyway.
Thank you. So I've spent 25 years in the publishing industry. I started out on the traditional publishing side. Since 2014, I've been full-time freelance or independent. Primarily, I offer education and reporting to writers on the publishing industry. And some of you know that I had an experience with AI book fraud last summer, which has led to countless media appearances with people who have no idea this is occurring and are surprised when they see it happening. So that's been pretty entertaining to watch unfold, and I'm sure we're going to touch on some of those news stories as we get underway here.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. And of course, I am Andrea Guevara. If you don't know me, I am an author brand strategist, and I came to this as a writer whose most of life experience was in brand strategy and design for businesses. And years ago, when I started getting back into the writing world, I realized that people needed to be teaching writers how to brand themselves and protect their personal brands. So that's my end of this. And we'll be going through all these different ways to look at the facts, figure out how you can protect yourself the ways that we can. You'll see that's kind of a tenuous thing sometimes. But anyway, let's get started. I am kind of your host today, and I'll be chiming in, but really Rebecca and Jane are the real experts. So I am going to start off with just opening up the door to talk about the state of AI and publishing right now. And I want to start with what we're calling kind of AI input. We kind of broke this into two categories for you: input, output. So input is the kinds of stories you've heard about where, AI is using all of these copywritten books to feed its machine of knowledge. So I want to open up, and maybe we can talk about, maybe one of you might touch a little bit on that in case some of the people here haven't heard the details on what happened there and why that was a big thing. You want to go ahead, Jane?
Sure. So, this has been maybe at least a year and a half now that, some of the big models became available to the public and people started asking questions about what the models were trained on. And I would say a tipping point for me was when there was a really significant story that came out in the Atlantic that somehow got a hold of one of the data sets that's been used by a lot of the AI models. I think the headline said 183,000 books have been trained on AI, and it actually had a way for you to search the data set to see if your book was in there. I believe that's still available. You can go and see, check for yourself. But that week, I saw so many authors posting screenshots of the fact that their book was in the mix. So many traditionally published books were in the mix, as were other best-selling books. Really, it's almost like, in some regard, like the ship's already sailed. Like if you fear that your published books have been trained in these models, it's already happened. So where we're at right now is advocacy organizations and the authors themselves are suing to get some sort of compensation. I don't think anyone believes we're going to turn back the clock. That would be very hard to do. I don't think any of these companies are going to start from scratch, although I'm interested to hear what Rebecca might say about that, if they actually could or would. And now we're starting to see licensing agreements, in fact. Now, none of the big publishers have yet, to my knowledge, made a big licensing agreement. I know that like HarperCollins is in talks with, or HarperCollins' parent company, News Corp, is in talks with doing a license agreement. We've already seen licensing agreements with major media organizations. Others are suing, like the New York Times. But in any event, all that to say, there are lawsuits. There are many lawsuits about the scraping of content, which has happened not just in books, of course, but also just the general web. And it's not just affecting book publishing, it affects people who deal with images, video, and obviously there are new tools coming out all the time related to multimedia, and those models have been trained on something, and there's not a whole lot of transparency on how the training has occurred and if the materials were legally obtained or illegally obtained. So that's also one of the issues. And the cherry on top, and then I'll let Rebecca chime in, is that every country looks at this a little differently. So there's also going to be a lot of international collaboration that's going to have to happen, because as it stands now, there might be some things that are allowed in Europe or Japan or China that are not allowed here, or vice versa. So there's a lot to work through.
And from the tech company side, I think to Jane's point about whether they could start over with only licensed or non-copyrighted information, there are some tools that are specifically trying to only use copyrighted data, but for the most part, the big models are relying on the fact that they can have free data. In fact, Mark Andreessen, who is a big VC, runs Andreessen Horowitz, and has invested in lots of these models. He has said that it would not work. The business of AI would not work if they had to actually license and pay for the data that they're using. And this problem is becoming even clearer now, as more and more of the data that's out there on the internet is being scraped and ingested into these different models, and the race for the best model continues. More of the companies are recognizing that they're going to run out of data. I think it was 2026 that the internet will run out of data that they can use to ingest into these models, and may start having to use synthetic data, which is another issue that is really troubling, because it's AI created data to then feed more AI models. So the data, which, in the case of our conversation, are copyrighted books, is really critical to these models. And the fact that they're free is really critical to the business of these tech companies making these models.
Yeah, so there are a million questions I could ask from here. One of the things that we've all talked about before that I think is important to discuss in this context is, what are when we're looking at some of the key lawsuits, what are some of the issues that you see in trying to enforce something like this? As Jane noted, and Rebecca, you said this before to me as well, like, let's say, New York Times wins their lawsuit, or, Authors Guild or whatever. There's still, that can only be enforced, and even then that's questionable, within the United States. So what are some of the, not just geographic, but what are some of the limitations or things that you two see as kind of things that we're bumping up against with these lawsuits?
Well, there's actually a question right now in the Q&A that directly speaks to one of the problems, which is if AI reads a published work or ingests it and, does something with it, how is that a legal problem? And
Right.
I think what you see right now is an enormous debate between tech companies and creators and media or rights holders about is ingestion of this material, or is the mechanical reading of it, or is the training, does this constitute copyright infringement? So if you look at the lawsuits that are out there, and there are many, some of them are really broad reaching in what they're trying to do as far as what they're saying is infringement. They say that the training is infringement and the output is infringement. It's all infringement and it needs to stop now. Mm-hmm. And some of the very first lawsuits, like the Sarah Silverman lawsuit, was very broad reaching in that regard. And I can tell you that copyright lawyers don't think very highly of that particular kind of lawsuit because it's hard to defend. And in fact, some of the claims have already been thrown out by the judges. But if you look at the Getty lawsuit specifically, which had to do with the ingestion of material for training, I think it's Stability AI. If you look at the Authors Guild lawsuit, which is very narrowly focused on the training of fiction work, which, fiction is very creative in nature. I hope we agree. And so for the Authors Guild, it's a little bit of an easier case to prove. If you go look at the lawsuit, they have all sorts of exhibits that you can take a look at that are arguments that are easier to make because they're talking about novels. But then you've got the New York Times lawsuit, where they're looking at the outputs as a way to show why this is infringing, which is actually really hard to do with the AI models, in my opinion, to show that the outputs actually constitute copyright infringement. But through a great deal of prompting and some say manipulation of the model, they were able to get ChatGPT specifically to output information that basically regurgitates almost wholesale some of the information that's been published in the New York Times. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that I won't get into here. You can go read some articles about it. But generally, the tech companies see this as flaws they have to correct. The models aren't supposed to just straight up regurgitate copyrighted material. But that is what happens. And, some people call this the Italian plumber problem, where if you prompt a model to produce an Italian plumber, you're probably going to get Mario from Super Mario Brothers, and things like that. But I think, maybe Rebecca can jump in with how, why the tech companies perhaps see this as fair use. I mean, that's the argument they're likely to make in court, that this is fair use, and that the ingestion does not constitute infringement.
Yeah, so it all hinges on this idea of fair use, which is an interesting idea, very, very old idea and an interesting idea, but originally was designed for humans, right? So humans should be able to read a book, look at a thing. It was designed before there was an internet, but let's say internet. Read a book, look at the internet, put all that information into a human brain, and then output their own creative ideas, right? And so that argument now is being used for these models. So these models are sort of being equated with humans who are able to look at a book, look at the internet, put it in their brain, and then output something entirely different. And so a lot of the tech companies are using that argument that it is the same. It's the same as is for a human and for a computer. Other arguments are technology-based, but old technology-based. So the one that I think is so interesting is video recording. It's okay to video record. There was a precedent that was ruled it's okay to video record an original piece of moving information, movie, TV show, because of fair use. So a human can videotape, Gone with the Wind if it plays on TV, and then use that for themselves and watch it over and over again. Again, it's sort of like equating a human action with a computer action. So that's an interesting idea. But I think it really does reflect how a lot of the tech companies are thinking about these models. They really are thinking about them. I mean, they're not thinking about them as human exactly, but they are thinking about them as acting in that way, as like consuming and then outputting something original. And so the argument is really that it is there are precedents, and the human precedents should apply to these more mechanized situations.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest aha moments I've had in talking with both of you in preparation for this and reading through things, is just like, how do you legislate thought? Because that's really what we're what we're trying to do now. We're a little behind. This is like, we probably should have been doing this 20 years ago. But
well, I'd love to speak to that for just a moment, because I think that is something that's also interesting. The question that you started with was enforcement. And I think that is always hard with technology, because the laws are always catching up with advances in technology. And I have written a lot about crypto, and I think crypto is an interesting analogous situation where the technology was trying to do something different with money, and the legal institutions were really working hard to play catch up on what the technology was already doing. And I think that we can now see in the headlines in the last year, the enforcement has caught up with the crypto industry. It took years and a lot of people lost a lot of money, but enforcement did catch up and the law did catch up. And so I think that is an interesting way to think about what's happening right now.
Yeah, I like that analogy. So as we've kind of already gently transitioned to talking about output, we have a spectrum of output, right? We've got the ingestion and creation of new material. And then we've got straight up just stealing stuff, which is the segue to having Jane talk about her experience.
Yeah. So I do have some exhibits. I'll do a screen share. So here's the kind of weird thing. What happened to me, I don't think it constitutes copyright infringement necessarily. I mean, that's the whole nature of AI generated material. It's the outputs could have a lot of similarities, but it's not supposed to regurgitate what you wrote. It might write something in the spirit of what you would write, and that's not infringement. So last summer, I discovered about half a dozen books available for sale on Amazon. And they were also in my Goodreads profile. And since I don't publish books that often, I've published one since 2018. This isn't something I'm monitoring. So it was a reader who told me that these books were on Amazon and they thought I ought to know about it because they didn't look like I had actually published them. And she was right. I had not published any of these books. They had been on the market for maybe 6 weeks. They were available in both print and ebook format. And a lot of people have asked me, why did I think they were AI generated? And it's because I've used these tools myself. I know what it looks like when you ask ChatGPT to write in the spirit of Jane Friedman on a publishing topic. I've done the vanity prompting, and everyone should really, just to see what happens. And so it's really the sort of writing that you'll find in these books had you bought them. It's just very generic. It's bloviating nonsense. It doesn't have anything helpful. And for me, I doubt a lot of these sold. I mean, if they sold at all, they were in Kindle Unlimited. So that's probably how they were earning money, if I had to guess. But, it's more reputational harm. If someone actually thinks that I wrote these, they would probably not want to engage with me on any other project or buy anything else I have to offer because they're just bad. Now, so when I tried to get this taken down from Amazon, Amazon said, well, it's not copyright infringement and you don't have a trademark on your name. So sorry, we're not doing anything about it. So the law that's actually being broken here has to do with right of publicity. And whoever it was that was doing this, I don't know, was trading unfairly on my name. So basically committing fraud, trying to trick people into buying something under false pretense. So there are laws against that, but it's obviously not easy or cheap to bring a lawsuit. And so my solution was to make a big stink about it and create public pressure for Amazon to take these down, which they did eventually. But not every author has this capability, right? I'm in a unique position. So since this happened, I actually haven't seen a whole lot of repeats of this exact situation where someone's just generating a lot of books with the author's name that are generated by AI. I have seen a lot of other things, though, that are upsetting. So, for example, actually, this is similar with a twist. So Ted Gioia is a really well-known jazz critic. He has a really popular Substack. So the two books you're looking at here, only one of them he wrote, and it's the one on the right. There was something that AI generated that came out with a slight twist on his name. You see Frank Gioia and Ted Alkier. Who knows who Ted is? But that's an AI generated book that's obviously trying to trick people into thinking this is a Ted Gioia book. So he had to get that taken down. The Today Show host, Savannah Guthrie, had a best-selling book some months ago, Mostly What God Does. And the publisher didn't print enough. And so Amazon was out of stock. So that's when kind of the fraudsters descended, now I don't know what they created exactly, because I didn't buy this, but they went in and created this knockoff with a slightly adjusted name, hoping to fool people. So you see this sort of thing happening along with workbooks. You see the workbook underneath it, workbook for Mostly What God Does. There's all sorts of workbook nonsense going on where people are generating summaries of books. Similarly, any well-known public figure, especially if they're currently in the news, like King Charles or someone else, you'll find these AI-generated biographies, really poor quality, but obviously they're getting purchased. There are reviews, and they're available both in ebook and print. What I found really distressing for people writing memoir is that there will be, after their memoir comes out, there will be like a memoir about the memoir. So the author of Ruskin Park, this is by a really well-known UK journalist, Rory Ketchen. He's got a really strange last name that I can't pronounce. Anyway, Rory got an alert from Amazon telling him, there's a new book you might like, and it came out like days after his official memoir. And then I think the other thing that's happening in really large quantities is just AI generated books that aren't very good. So low quality books, some people call them garbage books. If anyone saw the recent, I think it was a Vox article, or it was Quartz, we'll get it into the chat. But there was an article looking at where do all of these AI generated books come from? Who exactly is generating them? Is anyone actually making money on them? And there's a course that you can find at publishing.com. It's run by the Mickelson twins that basically teaches you how to use AI to generate these sorts of low quality books. And the New York Times did a big story on the travel category where this is happening quite a bit. And there's some really sad, funny quotes in that story about people buying these books and being like, gosh, they're not very good, are they? Thinking that, they were just traditionally published books. And then you get into just you can really go into some niche categories where there's AI generated work that actually might pose a danger to lives. Like if you pick the wrong mushroom and eat it, thinking it's edible and not poisonous, and it was AI generated, who is responsible for your death? So
this is how they're going to take us over. It's going to be the mushroom bugs.
So yeah, that's just scraping the surface of all of the stuff that's out there. Now, some people aren't concerned about all of this AI generated material because they say it's just like a race to the bottom. No one's discovering them. It does create a lot of noise in the ecosystem. Amazon has taken some steps to stop it in terms of like, okay, you can only publish 3 books a day. Or they also want people to disclose now if the material was AI generated on the back end, but they're not disclosing that on the front end. So one of my biggest concerns is just the general lack of transparency and accountability through the Amazon KDP system, self-publishing system, because you don't know who's publishing it. There aren't really any real author names attached. These are all pseudonyms or made up names. And they just, some of them, if they do make it into the news, they get taken down and no one has to answer for what's been done because Amazon's not telling who's behind the activity, and no one knows what they're purchasing really, unless they understand this phenomenon. So I've gone on long enough. I'll stop there.
There was a question that was great, but there was a question in the chat I just wanted to add on to because I think it's a good point. Jane's presentation is amazing and her reporting on the subject has been amazing. And it's true that things like this have happened in the past without AI, right? So it's not a new approach to scamming, but I think with AI, the danger is the kind of speed and scale that it's able to accomplish. And I think that's true, in this specific situation with Amazon, because we know even in other verticals, there's been a lot of problems with other kinds of products, right? That are sort of faulty products and you don't know which is the real product. But with AI, now that is just exploding. And it's very hard to track and it's very hard to regulate and it's very hard to enforce. So that's really like the big problem of AI is the scale of it.
Yeah. I find it interesting that IngramSpark, which is another self-publishing distribution, point, similar to Amazon KDP, years ago, before AI arrived on the scene, they decided, okay, no more low quality books, no more no content books, of which there was a growing amount at that time. And so that would define things like the workbooks that I showed, journals, other things that are really just trying to capitalize on someone else's IP in a very gray area of copyright. So I'm disappointed, of course, that Ingram has made this decision, and I'm sure for very good reasons, not to distribute that, but Amazon has not. If this sort of material is not earning Amazon money, I have to wonder how it benefits them to allow it to continue, other than they just don't want to have to be in the position of making these judgment calls.
And just to bring in a tech history perspective, I think, the tech companies generally, with all the social media platforms, any kind of platform, they don't like being in the business of regulating and mediating the kind of content that's out there. Historically, Facebook has said lots of things about what's happening with them. So I think that's part of this issue, is that the AI creates the scale of bad stuff, and the company with the platform that's hosting it doesn't want to be in the business of taking things down that are bad, because that's a lot of work. It's too much work for them to do. And so we have this problem that sort of started before the AI and is now just growing bigger and bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the questions that always comes to mind as we're talking about these things too. We see the difficulty in legislating this on a intellectual property or thought-based or copyright, way, but like a lot of things in America, is the way around it through commerce. So for instance, I could be really optimistic and say, well, use your dollars and don't buy books at Amazon or whatever. But clearly that hasn't worked, right? Like people are still going to buy those. So I wonder though, is this we've seen plenty of problems with actual human beings, not only creating this kind of work on Amazon, but also, review bombing on Goodreads and things like that. So is the solution perhaps maybe, again, a lawsuit, but it's like a group of authors or Authors Guild suing Amazon for having practices that are unethical and stealing money from authors, essentially? I wonder, do you think there's any chance of that, or is that also totally too optimistic to think that that could be a way in?
Unethical is not illegal. And I think that's sort of the cornerstone of a lot of this, frankly, right? Like I think the problem is like what we know, what we feel is wrong. It's not legally wrong and not always legally wrong. And it's because technology is moving far faster than the speed of enforcement and faster than laws. And so I think it's challenging to figure out the legal standing to approach a lot of these problems.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying this will solve anything, but there is a lawsuit underway by David Goggins, who's a best-selling author, because there were so many counterfeit copies of his books being sold. Now, I don't think this is really, as far as I know, he's not dealing with an AI issue. It's just fraudsters. And if you read his lawsuit, it is so eye-opening and entertaining in its clarity at how Amazon just really, really was negligent, because Goggins, over many months, tried to get them to act, and they only acted once the lawsuit was issued. And now there aren't any counterfeit copies of his book being sold. Imagine that. So I wish it were a class action, because he's not the only one who deals with these problems. But I imagine it will get settled out of court, and then things will continue as they did before. I'm sorry to say.
Well, let's transition to what we can do. I don't want everybody to feel super doom and gloomy. Let's talk about one of the ways that you can proactively try to protect your new work, at least, which is book contracts. So as a brand strategist who works with a lot of authors who are either getting new book deals or just got a new book deal and are, working on their brand, I have been shocked over the past year or two how few publishers and even literary agents are savvy to making sure that there are clauses in your contract about AI and protecting the use. So there are a few clauses you can use, and we have some links for you from the Authors Guild specifically that go through a bunch of these, which, by the way, at the end of this, when I send out the recording, we're also going to have a huge list of links for all these things we're talking about and these resources so that you can learn more and equip yourself. But some of the big three that I see in protecting your work and protecting your brand are, there's an AI learning clause, so restricting the use of your work so that AI can't learn from it. AI audiobook narration clause. I also think that's a really important one, especially because you're not only protecting yourself in that way, but you're protecting the jobs of real humans who would narrate. And then, do you two want to touch on any of the other clauses? There's way more than that, as I mentioned, but those are kind of the two big ones for me.
Did you mention book design? But cover design.
Not yet. Yeah.
Is one that I know. I think authors have had some success with. I will say that I know some publishers are reluctant to include like just a blanket or a broad clause that says no AI ever anywhere because they want to keep their options open, and they also I think reasonably want to be able to use AI internally for marketing and promotion, things that, that your work isn't going to be trained in a way that's available to the public, but internally it might be very helpful to your publisher to be able to query its internal AI with questions about your book, or to figure out new ways to market and promote that have been effective for other books. So I wouldn't want an author to shut down publisher capability entirely. But I feel like this is something that can be figured out on a contract basis.
Definitely. Yeah. It could get really specific.
It's also good to note that publishers are figuring out their AI strategy. And, there are multiple kind of players in this ecosystem, right? So there's authors, there's publishers, there's readers, there's distributors, and each of those characters has, their own incentives and their own kind of approach to this stuff. And so I think publishers are also trying to figure out what their relationship is to this content, and how much they want to, allow different kinds of access. So I think that's just also something to remember, that publishers have their own kind of thinking around AI and the future of AI and how they are trying to survive in this world too.
Yeah. And there is, the other thing I forgot to mention along with cover design is just like the editorial process as well, because as we will kind of touch on in the next section, is there anything wrong with using AI to help edit your work? So that's another thing. And like, should it be disclosed if that is the case? And so there's a lot of things like that. But, one of the things, this is not a technical tip, it's just a personal tip, is really, after you kind of digest what we're talking about today and you end up looking into maybe some of the links that we have, I would really encourage you to just kind of sit down and think about your work, how you want it to show up in the world, and, what you're comfortable with, what you're not, just as a personal check-in to kind of move forward from there, because it's really easy to get caught up in all the hypotheticals. And the reality is we're all just figuring this out. Nobody knows what's going to happen, really. So we're doing our best. So look at it that way if you can, because we're living in a very emerging time.
And one thing in this sphere that I think is interesting is Authors Guild is working on a new license, putting together kind of a licensing agreement that authors could use for their work. And so what's interesting with that, I think, is to your point, Andrea, about like, is commerce a solution? Well, is there a way to use your own IP to feed into the system in a way that benefits you with your consent and with your compensation, right? So that's an issue too, right? Are we just saying no one gets anything of mine, or is there a way for there to be a relationship that is beneficial to all the parties? It's a question mark, but I think that's what Authors Guild is trying to pursue.
That's a really good point too, because initially when I read about the Authors Guild lawsuit, I was like, why are they going about this way? The kind of, one of the premises is everybody's kind of in it. The data is going to be used and you can opt out. And I was like, wait, it should be the other way around. It shouldn't, but I think the reality is it's already there. And we don't really have a lot of control over what happens on the back end of things. So we have to be proactive in the ways that we know we can be. So a few other ways, and again, this will be included in the list of links that we send out later. Ways to kind of protect your personal brand as an author. A friend of mine, a colleague, said to me the other day, well, I'm not really worried about AI, are you? Because as long as I have my personal brand together, I should be good. And, that's the gospel that I preach all the time, because I believe that, having a personal brand as an author is a way to really help protect yourself and own your audience. But as we've seen with Jane's example, what happens when someone's impersonating that brand that you've worked so hard to build. And especially when you look at Jane's example of, she has billions of words out there on the internet because she's helped us for years, it's very easy for that AI learning to just pick it up and run. And so I know even for myself, there's like a kind of a fear that comes up like, well, I know I'm supposed to be writing stuff and getting stuff out there and promoting myself, but now is this going to be the thing that takes me down by putting my work out in the world? And we don't have, obviously, we cannot control that. However, we can focus on what we can control. One of which is like having your own, I know this sounds really rudimentary, but really establishing your own website under your name, establishing that that is kind of the official home base of you as a brand is one thing that is going to help if you do need to defend against AI impersonation or whatever down the road. In addition, there is a piece of code that you can put into your website that is supposed to help with blocking the AI learning. As Rebecca is smiling, we know that that's not a guarantee either, but it's better than nothing. And as things evolve, I have a feeling we're going to see different protection mechanisms come into play through website providers like Squarespace and WordPress and things like that. But for now, this is what we got. And that piece of code that you can have your developer put in your site will be in that list we're sending you. And then another important thing you can do is make sure that you just get that blue check on your social media profiles. That is a place where even human beings have been impersonating each other for a while. And if you can now get that blue check by paying for it, not just having to have 1 million followers. And that's important. And I think that's a really good development because they still verify your identity. I think you have to upload your driver's license or something like that so that they know it's actually you. But that can really help with the impersonation accounts too on social media. And then there are always, every piece of software basically nowadays is really excited about using AI and wants you to opt in, including Zoom, which we are not using their AI assistant right now because I don't think it's safe to have Zoom knowing everything we're doing. But pay attention to that. You know, we cannot read through every privacy agreement, every user agreement, but the ones that we can see, hey, do you want to use AI here? Opt out as much as possible, at least for the time being. And then, as Jane mentioned before, with one of the authors, it's a great idea to put together a Google alert for your name and possibly even your title of your books. We will include information on how to do that. It's very easy, but essentially Google will just email you a digest of if your name is mentioned online or if your book name is mentioned online. And that can help you keep tabs and at least get on things if something does come up that uses your name. And then the final thing is copyright and trademark registration, which of course is money and time and a lot. But if you're more of a nonfiction writer who has kind of a business built around your books or things like that, that can be worthwhile to look into trademark, copyright, and even patent for if it involves some software. So things like that are the old traditional ways, which may be a little outmoded, but hopefully we'll see some updates to that soon too. And then think about the software you use too. So for instance, the New York Times is suing Microsoft. Well, Microsoft owns Word, which is what a lot of us use to write. And we really don't know how much of that information is being shared or not. But I think that having been on the internet for a while, we can safely assume that anything Google, Microsoft, any of the major players that don't explicitly say they're protecting your privacy, you can assume that they have access to everything. And if you don't want that, then you need to choose different software. So one software that I use to write, as far as I know so far, is not using AI, is Scrivener. I also, this is not for writing, but I use Proton Mail. Proton is what Edward Snowden uses. It's highly encrypted. If you want to start pulling back some of the information that you're freely giving away to these tech giants. Okay, I'm going to let you guys jump in. I feel like I've bogarted this section a bit. I know we were going to talk about Authors Guild a bit with the back channel with Amazon.
Well, I can say that when I went through my episode last year, they were very proactive in stepping up to assist. If you're an Authors Guild member, that allows you to have access to their legal services department, at least at certain membership levels. And obviously, they're really on the forefront of advocating for authors' interests on this issue and many others. So I think anyone who's interested in any sort of protection, I would probably join the Authors Guild. Yeah. Whether it was their intervention that helped speed things up with a resolution with Amazon, I can't be entirely sure about that. But they do have back channel communications with Amazon. They're always dealing with all of those big companies, as well as the government, with these areas where they know that authors are not well equipped to deal on their own, or even the publishers themselves don't necessarily step in to help. So that's what the Authors Guild is for.
And I just want to do a plug for labor organizing generally, because I do think that unions and organizing have been really what have put a lot of pressure on tech companies in other areas. And so I think coming together as a group to sort of negotiate together with the Authors Guild and any other kind of organized bodies is really useful, because it's going to happen. The changes are really going to happen at the level of regulation, at the level of enforcement, and you need kind of a critical mass of workers in order to push that forward.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. This is the time for us to band together. And that's why we're doing this today too, because we want to be of service and share what we've learned, at least some of it, so that you can equip yourselves. And I second that. Join Authors Guild. It's only, I think it's like $20 a month, or it's very reasonable, and it supports that work, and we need that. Authors Guild also has a best practices, and as I mentioned before, examples of clauses for your contracts as well. And again, those will be in the links that we send you. Jane, I think you're going to pop in with something there.
Yeah, I don't want to cause undue anxiety because there is so much about this that is really out of your control. And sometimes I don't think it's even worth worrying about, not to downplay any of what we're talking about. That said, there was someone, or I don't think we've mentioned yet, there was a story that Meta was considering buying the entirety of Simon & Schuster in order to have more training data for its models. And they had also considered just paying outright for licenses of Simon & Schuster's catalog. I can't remember what figure they came up with, like $40 a book. Like, they actually have so much money, they could just pay billions for the data. And, it's a drop in the bucket for a company like Meta to buy a book publishing company. Anyway, one of the questions that came out of that was, well, if Meta did buy Simon & Schuster, could they really then just have access to all of that backlist without paying the authors further? The contract that authors signed does that, in fact, give the publisher the right to license out the data without asking for permission? And I think it's a real gray area. And I bring this up only because the Authors Guild is exactly the organization that if that sort of license by a big publisher to an AI company, which might happen, if that did cross a line, I think it's the Authors Guild that would, as well as maybe the agent organization, the AALA, that would stand up and say, look, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I know we've got Carly Waters and some other professionals in the room. So if they want to comment on their perspective on whether this is allowable, I certainly welcome that.
Yeah.
I also
Please.
want to add that whether or not it's allowable, I think it does really demonstrate the difference in worldview and mindset between the kind of tech companies that are thinking about building these tools and the publishing industry or creative industry in general, right? So it's not about is AI trying to replace creativity. It's really about the automation process. Like, is it possible to make more money out of content through AI? And so I think sometimes there's a disconnect between arguing around like, but it's bad quality. But it doesn't really necessarily affect the business argument for why it should be done. So I think that's just something also to understand about what's going on, is that there's sort of two different universes that are colliding and having very different conversations about the same topic.
Yeah. I did see, for those of you, Carly did, if you don't know Carly Waters, you should know Carly Waters. She's an awesome human and big agent. And she did chime in the chat with the AALA's stance, which is, you can read that. I'm not going to read it because I can't do two things at once.
I think the top level is no publishers don't automatically have the right to license a work for training. That's their position.
Wow. So that's good. And I think, I can help to think of it in terms of kind of when audiobooks came out and ebooks came out, those kind of things were not in the contracts yet because it was still evolving. And that's kind of where we're at with this too. It's going to be, people are concerned and they are working on figuring it out, but it's still really important for you as an author to advocate for yourself because everyone isn't caught up to speed.
And I do want to inject one moment of hope, which is like the analogy to the crypto industry. Like, it seemed 3 years ago like people were just crypto was just ruling the whole world and they had this huge scam. And now lots of people are in jail. Lots of people have had to pay money. It's, it takes a while, but and particularly this Department of Justice is really interested in cracking down on exactly this kind of thing that's happening with tech companies. So I do think like, a long view is a hopeful view.
That's a really good point, especially bringing up this Justice Department. I mean, we look at the fact that the big merger of Simon and Schuster and I'm blanking on the other public, that did not happen. They set a precedent there, and that was a big precedent to set. So there is hope. We just have to get through this Wild West. It's kind of the gold rush right now, unfortunately. And you got the gold. So, okay, let's do talk a little bit about the upsides to AI. Jane, do you want to start? I know you've done more of this than I have, dabbling wise.
Yeah. I mean, I'll first add the caveat that I use the paid version of ChatGPT, which creates a little bit of offense. I'm not saying I trust them implicitly, but it's just like an added layer that I'm not using the public tools, the free tools. So, for example, I'm revising my book, The Business of Being a Writer, and my publisher requires me to write really brief chapter summaries, as well as pull out other types of summarizations that they need for the book metadata, for marketing and promotion. And, we're talking about hours and hours and hours of work to create these summaries. ChatGPT, I can just feed in or upload a chapter PDF and have it spit back at me whatever length summary I require. I'm not saying I use it without further editing, but it gives me something to work with, and it saves me an untold amount of time creating these things that really are just, for me, it's busy work. It's not drawing on my higher writing capacities or thinking capacities. Now, should the publisher be doing that with their own internal AI tools at some point? Maybe. But I'm happy to do it with my own tools for now. I also have to come up with all sorts of marketing copy for like classes that I run. And it just makes it so much simpler to have it come up with a rough draft. I've also fed into it chapters or blog posts or like a bunch of my writing on a very specific topic and asked it to come up with a slide outline for a presentation. Again, I'm not saying I do it without then doing a lot of my own editing, but it's nice not to start with a blank page, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I see, some questions popping up in the chat about the issues around that. And I think when you're thinking about whether or not you're going to use these AI tools, that is where we go back to that idea of kind of checking in with yourself again and what you are willing to do and not do and how you want to show up in the world. I have used ChatGPT as well for brainstorming things or researching things, but never for me. I land more on the paranoia side, and so I never put anything specific to my work or like a client or anything that would be identifiable. So that's something that you could do too. Like Jane was saying, you could use it to generate some ideas for things. Like for instance, if you're thinking about, well, what do I want to do blog posts about, or what do I want to do social media posts about? Just that's a little bit safer use in terms of you're not revealing anything of your work, but you could literally be like, hey, what are 10 ideas about for social media posts about novel characters or whatever. That's a really pretty benign thing to use it for. We also, Grammarly has an AI integration now. I haven't used it yet. Have you guys used that? Yeah, I'm a little not comfortable with that, but again, if you are, it's available to you.
I think, like, just to be really frank and honest with everyone attending, if they're not aware, there are already writers who are using software like Sudowrite, SUDO, Sudowrite, to help them generate their entire novel. I'm not saying they're uploading the entire novel as generated, but I have seen things very close to that are currently being sold in digital storytelling marketplaces. So that's I'm not saying that gives you permission or that means let's all do it too, but I do think once we get further out in another, I don't know how fast this is going to move, but another few years, 5 years, at least 10 years, I think it's going to be pretty accepted that people will be using AI as kind of their best writing buddy to help produce their work. And I'm just setting aside all of the legal considerations, all of the privacy considerations.
Right.
I'm just going to pretend those don't exist. And I know that's not quite fair, but I do think that's where we're headed.
I think again, just to look a little bit at tech history, like there's this huge open source movement, which has been around for a long time, but the idea being like, well, you can't trust any tech company product ever, right? Like, don't use Gmail, don't use Google Docs, don't use an Apple computer, don't use anything because it's bad, right? And I think you could take that really hardline stance, but our world is infiltrated with tech stuff, and it's really hard to take a really hardline stance. And now AI features are being released in every one of those products, to be honest. And so I think to feel like it's possible to say you're not going to do any of that is a great burden. And so I don't think that anyone should take on, unless you are a really hardline open source type of person, that I congratulate you. But otherwise, just keep in mind that the Pandora's box is open, and you are not responsible for closing it. So there's think more about the people in Washington, D.C. and the Authors Guild and organizations that can really push things forward at a bigger level.
That's a really good reminder. Yeah, it is definitely, this is here. There's nothing we can do about it being here. So we're figuring it out as we go. But you're right. We often, I know at least for myself, I'm like, what can I do? What can I do? And a lot of times we don't have a lot of power as individuals with these big, fast moving movements. But there are people who are actively working on it, and not to just be putting blind faith and everybody else will figure it out. But there is an element of that because we still have to function in our daily lives. So to that point, this is obviously a conversation that just scratches the surface of a lot of things. And it's a conversation that we want to keep going. And I have been working with Rebecca and also talking with Jane about, future events and hopefully live events with other experts. And so part of us coming here today is to let you know that we want to continue this conversation, but also to ask you to help us with finding more experts to talk specifically about AI and book publishing. And we're really, really wanting this to be people of color and leaning more towards women, because let's face it, tech is generally white dudes. And we want to change that conversation because we didn't even get into the ramifications of how AI is ostracizing marginalized folks, but we really want that perspective for this to be a diverse conversation. So if you know of anyone, or maybe you are an expert in these areas, we're looking for people from all sorts of areas of expertise. That could be agent, you could be an author that's had experience with AI. Publishing professionals would be amazing, attorneys, intellectual property. We have a form that you can actually fill out so that we can keep track of all of these things. We're going to put that in the chat here in a second. Luke just put it in there for everybody. It says the link says jot form. So if you can hop over there later, we'll also send it in the email that we send out, but that would be super helpful because we want to have more of these conversations to get more specific as we navigate this gold rush together. So let's open it up for questions. We are totally over time and I'm sorry. I was like, oh, 20 minutes just went by. Are we okay to stay a little over? I apologize to those of you who have to leave, but as we said, this is being recorded. So, Luke, do you want to start with questions for us, or I can jump in?
Yeah, I think maybe there's a lot, so I think you might have a perspective on what might be the most poignant ones.
One that I saw that I think would be great to answer is the difference between AI and automation. Just because we didn't really talk about terms when we were kind of going into this conversation. And I think it's funny because when I was working on AI at tech companies, the rule internally was we don't call it AI because no one understands what AI means. AI doesn't mean anything. And AI doesn't mean anything. So we don't do that. And now it's totally reversed. And I think it's true that AI doesn't mean anything. So what we have been talking about mostly is generative AI, which is a process by which a model is trained on data sets and then tuned by a human engineer who's thinking about how to translate the data set into output. And then that AI generates new content based on the data set. So that's really the kind of AI that we're talking about. And there's tons of other kinds of automation and machine learning. And it's in everything, right? Machine learning is in everything. Generative AI isn't quite in everything yet, but that is kind of the thing that we're talking about today.
Yeah. If you remember too, back in the day when we were looking at legislating things about the internet in general too, there was a lot of like, well, we really can't legislate anything. And we have found our way with that too. I mean, one instance that you probably notice on most websites, for instance, is like that little pop-up that comes up that says, do you accept the cookies and such? You know, that was the effort of a lot of people putting into place more protections for you to opt out of things. So even though it feels crazy, it is, there are things happening. I wanted to, oh, sorry, did you want to say something about that?
Oh, no, I was just going to say there's a pretty good question that I thought we could answer because it just represents a big issue that we never touched on.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. So the question is from Joel, and he's asking if we can talk about how publishers are looking at publishing books using AI generated material. His understanding is that they won't publish anything AI written or anything edited with AI. And do you think they will hold fast with that stance, or will they change? And so it is true that just in the broadest sense, the bigger publishers have said we're not interested in publishing AI generated books, but I think we all have to take that with a grain of salt. I don't think anyone can predict what will happen in that regard. And I think they could change their mind depending on just how the technology develops and what readers seem to want or what the market is demanding. So I'm not comfortable making a prediction on how they're going to feel about that. That said, as of today, you can't get copyright protection over AI generated work. So, and there have been people trying to test the limits of what the US Copyright Office will protect. There was a case just recently, within the last couple of weeks, of someone trying to push the limits. And as far as the Copyright Office will go, it's basically saying if the work is AI assisted, meaning some amount of it was generated by AI, and then you went in and made your own edits line by line, we're going to protect the work as like this bigger entity. You have protection for the arrangement of the words and the sentences, but we are not protecting you on a sentence by sentence or paragraph by paragraph level, meaning someone could take those sentences and paragraphs and rearrange them and then, you know, I guess profit. I don't know how you would, but in any event, that's the other piece of this we didn't touch on, which is how will AI generated work in the future, whether, and how much assistance or not assistance, like at what point is it fully protected under copyright, and where do you draw the line? And the US Copyright Office recently asked for comments and feedback from the public to help them try and determine new legislation, essentially, or new rules or new policy making. And they had so much feedback from everybody that I think they're still going through it. So all that to say, there's just a lot of uncertainty surrounding this particular issue. And I don't, you know, even though authors themselves, I think, are already publishing AI generated work, no one knows what's generated and what's not. And Rebecca, I don't know, maybe you can speak to how well we even know. Like, I don't think there are any tests that can tell us if something's AI generated.
Lots of tools out there to try, but it's really hard. It's really challenging. And I think that's why there's so much controversy around what the New York Times did to prove their case. So it's really, really hard to prove any of this or to like find a fingerprint. And that's, I think, also why AI labeling is an issue that Authors Guild and other organizations are pushing for. It's more transparency because it's so hard to figure it out without that transparency.
Yeah. So far, though, I don't think there are any, like, I think the publisher wants authors to disclose AI use, so just so everyone's on the same page about what has been done or not done. There have been some really good articles written by various people saying, look, it's in everyone's interests in the traditional publishing community if we're upfront about what we've done, if we're upfront with authors about how we've used AI in order to engender trust. So I'm certainly on board with that. But because like it's right now, it's the trust factor. Like it's everyone taking everyone at their word about what they've used or not used. And I don't know that publishers would necessarily be upset if an author used Grammarly's AI tools to edit their work. Like, I don't think that's crossing a line for anybody, but I would tell them what you've done.
Yeah, that's a good point too. There's a question here that I think we can answer pretty quickly. Someone asked, are any of these AI generated books ever available as print books? And the follow-up is, will we find them at local bookstores?
Yes. So there was actually one title I followed very specifically about the Maui fires. So this was something that actually made its way onto Bookshop and Barnes and Noble because it entered the distribution system through Amazon's extended distribution program. And it was being sold in print and an ebook. And whether it entered Ingram, I can't say. But if it was in Bookshop, probably, because I think Bookshop is populated by Ingram. So that means a bookstore could have ordered it and could have stocked it. So yeah, they're entering the greater ecosystem. It's more expensive for that to happen on the part of the person publishing. But yeah, there's no reason it isn't or couldn't happen.
Yeah, all the more reason to support your local bookstore so that you have actual humans making those decisions, right? What books are coming in, hopefully. I have another question that I'm going to dovetail with a comment that I see in the chat, which is just touching on how all of this affects authors with disabilities, which I think is a really good thing to bring up. And so the question is, in this specific way, what are our thoughts on people using speech-to-text technology and using AI to make the content more coherent? And then just in the chat, they mentioned, like one way that teachers are trying to protect AI or protect the integrity of content is to make kids use a pencil and paper instead of using digital tools. So I'd be curious to see what you two think. I know the three of us do not have vision problems. I don't have any dexterity problems or things like that. I shouldn't say problems, sorry. Disabilities. But I think this does raise a really good point in thinking about how do we account for those things? Because some of these tools could be very powerful, especially when we know we don't hear enough disabled voices.
And I think just to bring in sort of like the tech historical perspective, I think often those kinds of use cases are the ones that have sparked some of this innovation in the first place, right? So like a lot of the tech companies have ideas around accessibility, like either in like allowing somebody who has disabilities to have more access, or just having people who didn't have access to have more access, and in kind of a diversity of opportunities, right? So like the whole concept behind technology is that it can scale to lots of different people in lots of different places that wouldn't traditionally be able to access kind of like resources around publishing. And publishing is traditionally a very like gate kept and limited and Western place, right? So I think that's a really hard question, because I think we can't just be like tech is bad. I certainly can't. I worked in it for 10 years. Tech is just evil and there's no good reason to do anything. I think a lot of the good reasons for these tools are accessibility reasons. And I think it's just a more complicated ecosystem of cause and effect than that too.
Yeah. And I would, oh, sorry.
It's okay. I think just very broadly speaking, I think publishers want to make accommodations. Like, especially, I speak as someone who worked at a university as a professor and had students who needed special accommodations. And there's, usually offices and people who try to make that happen by being in touch with the publisher to provide whatever is needed. But I do think there are times when publishers feel like a line gets crossed. Like, for example, when Audible wanted to use the text of audiobooks, like they wanted to scroll the text on the screen as the book was being narrated. And publishers really objected to that because they felt like it was something that needed to be licensed separately, and they essentially won that battle. I don't think they ultimately had to go to court, but some people defended that as this is an accommodation for people who might have disabilities, and this helps them with the comprehension. I can't say how valid that was, but I do think that AI opens up a lot of interesting possibilities for more accessibility for books. And we're already seeing it happen especially with audio, because the AI voices are so good now. You're seeing HarperCollins and other big publishers partner with AI labs to do backlist audio publishing and translation. So it's not that I don't think any narrators are going to go out of work because of this, because the costs for narration are so high, and there's so many books. Okay, there's so many books. Even if you put all the narrators to work 24/7, they wouldn't be able to cover all the backlist we're talking about in the next 10 years. So I do think the technology is going to help make those backlist books, the older books, the scholarly books, much more available to people who want them and need them.
That's a good point as well. And I was just going to chime in and say this is a great opportunity if you are someone who would like to talk about this publicly with regards to AI, or you know an expert. Again, please do fill out that form, and I'll put it in the chat again here to let us know if you'd like to have conversations on this to help others. Okay, let's see. We are at 11:18. Should we do one more question? Okay.
Sure. One more question.
It is so hard. I keep thinking I know which question, and then I'm like, oh, this is going to be too. I will just say this. There are a lot of really technical questions in here that I think we are not qualified to answer along the lines of how some of these contract clauses are enforceable and things like that. But hopefully we will get some intellectual property attorneys and possibly agents to speak on that in the future. So I'm going to go back to an easy one. Oh God, no, it's not easy. Sorry. Oh my gosh. Okay. Sorry, guys. I thought I had it. There's just so many. Okay. As an editor, what are some resources I can use to identify AI-created submissions? That should hopefully be an easy answer, unfortunately.
I personally don't think it's an easy answer.
Okay.
I don't know that I think there are a bunch of tools out there, and you can Google. I don't know that there's one that's best in class, and I also don't know that there's one that's reliable, frankly. It's just a very hard task. So I think there's other tricks at the input level, at the assignment level, at the guidelines for students kind of level, but it is kind of challenging once it's in.
Yeah, it's kind of if you want to understand better how it works, I would suggest just dabbling with ChatGPT so you can kind of see how that how it works. That will give you an idea of unfortunately kind of just how hard it is to detect just as a human being.
I mean, I will add that I've had people try to slip AI generated content by me. I can always tell. Now, that's not to say that the models won't improve and the technology will advance, and at some point I will not be able to tell.
Right.
But one of my uses for ChatGPT is actually posing questions or asking it to come up with material that I'm thinking about so that I can avoid saying the most cliche,
right,
vacant things. So it's like its lowest common denominator for some of the major models. Now, there is going to be a link in the resource guide where there's a fascinating conversation that I summarized between two novelists on the literary end of the page, who feel like if you were able to train your own personal chat GPT with like your own words and other things, like you wanted a dash of Dickens and you wanted a little bit of Beckett, or, you know, you can create this Frankenstein model of just what you want to be your AI writing buddy. And that's, for me, I think that's a very stimulating, interesting thing to be able to do in your own like kind of private creativity domain. And I think people aren't often thinking about that potential. They're mainly thinking about these big major public models. And of course, what I've just described also raises this interesting question of what if you trained a model on like all of Stephen King's content to generate more Stephen King novels? And I think we can all agree that's infringement. I think we'll see.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway,
yeah, it's already been done too, right? Like there's a Lou Reed model. A lot of them though are built on the like ChatGPT now allows you to sort of take their model and do a personalization, and that is the trend in tech in the enterprise world. That is the real trend of how AI is being used, trained on a company's individual needs and then used internally just like in their language. So I do think like personalization of these models is the future. And so I do think, so then it just becomes a question of like what's happening to the training that you're doing on these models. Like where is that going, or is that staying with you too?
Yeah, that's a really good point too. And I should have clarified, I think it is very easy to tell when something is totally AI generated, but if you're using it for ideas or say you're using it for editing, I think that's where it would be pretty hard to tell, as long as the person really kind of worked with it. Yeah, I saw something in the chat really quickly about, oh, it's too far up. We'll find it. We have a very active chat. We have a very active Q&A. And so we will, I will get this out to everybody, the recording, as much of these things that I can send to you as well, the links, all the resources. And please do consider submitting experts to that form. We would really appreciate it because, as we've said again, this is just a lot and we've barely scratched the surface today, but hopefully it's at least helped you wrap your head around it a little bit more. I really want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank Jane Friedman and Rebecca Ackermann for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and insights. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Stay tuned for the recording in a day or two. Bye-bye.
Bye.